In the summer of 1991, a paleontological research team was fossil hunting in the Badlands of Saskatchewan, Canada. With them was a local school teacher named Robert Gebhardt. Now, the team was actually trying to find small stuff. They were looking for teeth like this one. This tiny tooth belongs to a little Mesozoic mammal, one of our little furball ancestors that used to live alongside the dinosaurs. Robert Gebhardt made his way along a hill, and the fossil caught his eye. It wasn't a mammal tooth. It was a vertebra from the tail of a dinosaur. Robert called to the team's paleontologists, Tim Takarik and Dr. John Storer. They looked at the vertebra and got very excited. They knew from the shape of the bone that it must belong to a big carnivorous dinosaur. And the only big carnivorous dinosaur known from these rock layers was Tyrannosaurus rex. But what no one could have known at the time is that Robert Gebhardt had just discovered the largest dinosaur ever found in Canada and the world's biggest T-Rex.
Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Persons. I'm a paleontologist here at the Mace Brown Museum of Natural History at the College of Charleston. In case you're wondering, the skull behind me there, that belongs to the great hadrosaur or duckbill dinosaur Edmontosaurus, a favorite snack of Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, you may be wondering, where was I in the story that I just told you? Well, I was in elementary school. I was in about third grade back when that colossal Tyrannosaurus skeleton was first discovered. But I already knew that I wanted to grow up to be a paleontologist. As a matter of fact, I'm told I've wanted to be a paleontologist since I was 2.5 years old, although I don't remember that far back. Apparently, my love of dinosaurs began here in the city of Las Vegas. Now, my father went on a business trip to Las Vegas, a legitimate business trip, and not being a gambling fellow himself, he made a trip to a little desert museum. And as in all good museums, after he'd seen the gallery, he was forced to exit through the gift shop. And there in the shop, he found this, a little paperback storybook called The Big Little Dinosaur. Well, he brought that book home to me, and I had him read it to me, and read it to me again, and again, and again. And from there on out, studying dinosaurs is what I wanted to do. Here's a photo of my dad and I. My father is a ginseng farmer, by the way. That's what the roots are there in the front. I'm including this picture not so you can see how adorable I am in my little overalls, but because it shows where I grew up, which was on a farm in the mountains of North Carolina. And in particular, if you look over my dad's shoulders there, you can see one of those mountains that makes up part of the Appalachian Mountain chain. So my hometown of Tuckasegee is right there. And growing up as a kid who really, really wanted to dig up dinosaurs, that was a terrible location. Don't get me wrong, my hometown is quite nice, but those gosh darn Appalachian Mountains present a serious paleontological problem. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Rocky Mountains. Those may be the mountains in your neighborhood. And having a look at this image here, you may scoff and say, well, those hardly look like mountains at all, do they? They're just sort of gently rolling hills. And you have a point. The Appalachian Mountains lack the very tall and craggy peaks of the Rocky Mountains. And that's because the Appalachian Mountains are very, very old. And over time, their peaks have been eroded away. In fact, the Appalachian Mountains formed over 230 million years ago. Now, at this point in time, all the world's continents had come together to form a single enormous supercontinent that we call Pangaea. But they didn't all come together quietly. When enormous continents collided with each other, sometimes they would push each other upwards, and you would get mountain formations as a result. This is how the Appalachians came to be, such that if we zoomed in on my hometown 230 million years ago, it would look like this. There would be enormous peaks, even larger than what you see today in the Rockies. And that is a problem. It's a problem not because there weren't dinosaurs there living on those mountains. Indeed, there were. In fact, about 230 million years ago is when some of the very first dinosaurs and some of the dinosaurs' ancient ancestors first evolved. So you would have dinosaurs and proto-dinosaurs running around across these mountains, but you don't get their fossils preserved. It's a sad truth of geology that animals that live in mountains don't give us much of a fossil record. Can you figure out why? Well, it's because if you die on a mountain, if you leave your skeleton behind, what happens to it? Well, just like all the sediments, all those rocks that form those tall peaks have eroded away, your bones would erode away and tumble down with them. In order to become fossilized, a skeleton first needs to wind up being buried. Ideally, it needs to get buried very, very quickly. And on a mountain, everything's being pushed upwards, nothing is being deposited over top of you. So we don't have a good record of any dinosaurs that lived on tall mountains. The spot where Robert Gebhardt was able to make his astounding discovery is in Saskatchewan, Canada. And that is a wonderful place to go looking for fossils from the age of dinosaurs. Let me tell you why. Let's have a look now towards the very, very end of the age of dinosaurs, into the late Cretaceous period. This is what the world pretty much looked like. Now, you can see that the continents have split apart, and they're two pretty close what their location is today. But you'll notice that sea level is quite different. Many of the continental interiors are actually flooded. They're covered by some water. That's because throughout the age of dinosaurs, there was a greenhouse Earth. Volcanic activity had released a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that meant that the global temperatures were much higher, which caused polar ice caps to melt, and that extra meltwater had filled the world's oceans and raised sea level up. This caused widespread flooding. Now, speaking of volcanic activity, at this point in time, the Rocky Mountains themselves along the west of North America are beginning to form, in some cases in violent volcanic eruptions. And you would find dinosaurs hanging out in those mountains, but we also don't wind up getting them preserved. Instead, if we head a little bit east of the Rockies, we can head down towards a little remnant of the inland sea that once filled North America. And we can actually find in the center of the continent beachfront property. Now, there would be a wonderful place for dinosaur fossils to be preserved. Hanging out in these subtropical lowland environments in the marshes and the forests and the beaches, you would have thriving communities of big herbivorous dinosaurs and a few carnivorous dinosaurs there to eat them. And when those dinosaurs died, their bodies, their heavy skeletons, could sink down into the wet soil. And as the Rocky Mountains are being pushed up, they're starting to erode away. And rivers flowing down from those mountains will transport that eroding sediment in to these basins. So the dinosaur, now sinking low, gets covered up by more and more sediment. And this sequence of more and more strata being put on top of the buried dinosaur continues even after the dinosaur's extinction, such that the fossils are buried and they are preserved. So let's check back in on the Tyrannosaur specimen. Now, the team that originally found it, they weren't equipped to start excavating a Tyrannosaur skeleton, so the specimen was left alone for a little while. And then they returned to check it out again and see if maybe there's actually more to it. At one point, the group got very excited because they found what you see here. These are a series of teeth sticking out from the jaws of a Tyrannosaur. So they didn't just have the tail, they had bones from the other end. They had a Tyrannosaur skull. Well, that was caused for celebration. And it was decided that the diggers ought to give their super cool Tyrannosaur specimens, and it was now definitely going to turn out to be something that was worth excavating, a nickname. That's a common practice in dinosaur paleontology. Well, as the night wore on, it was determined that this Tyrannosaur would be nicknamed Scotty, after a bottle of old Scotch whiskey that was opened to toast the Tyrannosaur. But digging up a Tyrannosaurus rex is easier said than done. Those sediments that had piled up around and on top of Scotty's bones proved to be very, very hard. They were a very, very dense sandstone that actually contained a lot of iron in it. So it took a long time to start to excavate that skeleton. Here you can see a crew of dedicated diggers at work. Now, you can compare that to images that we often see of dinosaur digs happening in the movies. This is a shot of a raptor excavation from the film Jurassic Park. And that's not normally the way things go. Scotty was a very different situation. You couldn't begin to expose its bones just by brushing them away with a paintbrush. It required chiseling, it required jackhammering, it required serious work. And what's more, rather than having a beautiful skeleton that's 100% complete and with all the bones articulated, that is, all positioned next to each other just the way they would have been when the animal was alive, the skeleton looked like this. This is a shot of the Scotty quarry map. So this is a map that was made while the diggers were working on the fossils so that the various positions of the bones could be preserved. And you can see this is not a situation where the arm bones were nicely connected to the shoulder bones. It's totally a mess. The skeleton, the bones are all scattered about. You'll notice they actually seem to fall into two neat lines. Scotty seems to have been buried in a river channel with water flowing there in between the two piles of bones and the bones being stacked up on top of a prehistoric sandbar. So the digging went on. It took many years to start to uncover the bones, to chisel them out, and then to eventually get them lifted out of the quarry and taken back to where researchers could do even more work on them. Heavy machinery had to be brought in to lift up the big fossil blocks. This was not a case where individual bones were pulled out. Rather, large sections of the quarry were chiseled around and lifted up. One particularly troublesome block required more than man or machine power. It needed horsepower. The machinery couldn't be maneuvered down right up next to the block, and it was too heavy for the humans to lift. So a team of horses was brought in to drag the block out until the machines could get at it and lift it up. So now the bones have been found, they've been jacketed, they've been lifted up, but there's still even more work that needed to be done to them. In order to clean out the bones, they needed to be taken to a preparation facility. They were brought to the town of East End, Saskatchewan. And there, folks like this man, this is Wes Long, a fossil preparator extraordinaire, had to use a series of tools to very, very carefully chisel out the blocks. This was delicate work, and it took a very long time. While all this was happening, I grew up. I went to college to study paleontology. I went to Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. And for my grad school, I went to the University of Alberta, which is one of the best schools out there to study dinosaurs at. And my advisor was this man. This is Dr. Phil Curry. Dr. Curry was a paleontologist that I knew growing up. I'd seen him on documentaries on TV. He'd been on Discovery Channel and in National Geographic. He was a living legend. And getting to work with Dr. Curry has been one of the best experiences of my professional career. Well, I got my PhD at the University of Alberta, and I even stuck around there to do my postdoc work. And I remember I was working in the lab at one point. I was in the little room right next to Dr. Curry's office, and he calls me in. I come in, and he told me that he had a new project for me to work on. He had a tyrannosaur, and it was a big one. By this point, all the preparation work done on Scotty's bones was finally complete, and we knew just how relatively complete the skeleton actually was. As it turns out, there's about 65% of the bones in the skeleton preserved. So you can see a lot's missing, but a good portion of the animal is there. They've been all cleaned up and were ready for study, but they needed a paleontologist to write up a scientific description, to do the work of analyzing the fossils and to publish a report on it. That got to be my job. So Dr. Curry and I went to work. We began measuring, photographing, and analyzing every element of Scotty's skeleton. Here I am working on one toe bone. And this is me measuring a section of Scotty's skull. You can see each of those holes right there is where one big Tyrannosaurus fang would sit. Those are tooth sockets. Now, in our efforts, we were also joined by another paleontologist. This is Dr. Greg Erickson. He's another living legend. Dr. Erickson specializes in tyrannosaurs, and he also specializes in studying dinosaur growth. That would prove to be very important for the research that followed. This is the full skeletal mount of Scotty at the T-Rex Discovery Center in East End, Saskatchewan. Now, of course, these are not the real fossils. Many of them are casts of Scotty, and because the skeleton is incomplete, some of them are casts made from other Tyrannosaur specimens, so the gaps in the skeleton have been filled in. But based on our research, we estimate that Scotty is a very large Tyrannosaur. It would measure from the tip of its snout to the end of its nose about 13 meters. Now, estimating how long a dinosaur probably was is one thing, but to really get a sense for how big it is, we need to think about how much the animal actually weighed. And that's a much more difficult question. What gives most of our body its weight is actually the soft, squishy stuff. It's the muscles and the organs and all of our blood. But all of that gets lost. It rots away after we die. And for a dinosaur fossil, all you've got normally is the skeleton. Well, as it turns out, there are some portions of the skeleton that do give you a good indicator of how much the animal weighed. And one of those is the femur. The femur is the upper leg bone. It's the bone that runs from our hip down to our knee. Here is a femur from a Tyrannosaurus. Now, this is not the femur of Scotty. This belongs to a somewhat smaller Tyrannosaurus named Stan. The reason that the femur, though, is a good indicator of how much the animal weighed is because as a limb bone, its major function is to hold up the animal's body. So the proportions of the femur are adapted for how much weight it would have supported in life. And to determine the strength of a femur, what you want to look at is a point along the shaft where it becomes its narrowest. That's an indicator of the maximum amount of weight the femur could hold. So if you want to know how much Scotty weighed, you really need to ask, well, how big was its femur? Luckily, Scotty's skeleton did include one femur, and here it is. So if we have a look at the minimum girth of Scotty's femur, and we do some calculations based on measurements made of modern day animals, we come up with a weight estimation of about 8,870 kilograms. That is about 19,560 pounds, or roughly 9.8 tons. The proportions of the femur, as most of the other elements suggest, indicate that Scotty is the largest Tyrannosaurus rex known. Scotty is a record breaker in another sense too. Thanks to the work of Greg Erickson, we also know Scotty is the oldest Tyrannosaurus rex, by which I don't mean how many million years ago it lived. Rather, I mean how many candles there were on its last birthday cake. Now, how do you go about figuring out the age of a dinosaur, how old it was when it died? Well, you can have a look at the internal structure of its skeleton. This is a fossil from our collection here at the Mace Brown Museum. It's not a dinosaur. Instead, it's a chunk of petrified wood. Now, many of you probably know that if you cut down a tree, you can count the growth rings in the trunk of the tree to determine how old it was. Well, a chunk of petrified wood often records those same rings. And if you count them, you can figure out how old the tree was when it died. Similarly, the bones of dinosaurs, and this is a chunk here from a duck-billed dinosaur, can be cut into. And although most of the texture on the internal surface of the bone is all porous and spongy, as the dinosaurs grew, they also laid down bone in layers. And as you get towards the outer edge there, the last few years of a dinosaur's life are recorded there. So if you count the number of rings in the bone of a big dinosaur, and then look at the same bone from a smaller dinosaur that fills in the layer just below the size of those outer rings, and a smaller one, and a smaller one, and a smaller one, and a smaller one, like a series of Russian dinosaur nesting dolls, you can get an estimation of how many years the dinosaur must have been alive to have reached that size. When Dr. Erickson cut into the skeleton of Scotty, this is what he saw. These are magnified images of Scotty's bones. And at the very top of the one marked A, you can see just a few lines of growth. Based on this evidence, Scotty seems to have been a tyrannosaur that had reached maturity. And it seems to have been then at least 28 years old. That's maximum age for a tyrannosaur. These were animals that, as Dr. Erickson has said, grew fast and died relatively young. Let's talk now about the appearance of Scotty. And in particular, I want to talk about what it would be like to reach out and give Scotty a pet. If we were brave enough to do so, would we feel Scotty being fuzzy or scaly? Well, the animal in front of you is a small predatory dinosaur discovered in China and beautifully preserved. Running along its neck, its back, and its tail, you can see there's fuzz. This dinosaur is preserved with beautiful feathers. These are not the complex flight feathers of modern-day birds, but they're simple hair-like feathers. Many dinosaurs we now know are fuzzy, including many dinosaurs very closely related to Tyrannosaurus rex. But skin from tyrannosaurs has been found. This chunk of tyrannosaur hide comes from an Albertosaurus, and you can see there's no evidence of feathers. Instead, clearly preserved are a number of very small scales. If you were to reach out and give that skin a stroke, it would feel sort of pebbly, lots and lots of little bumps. Skin from Tyrannosaurus rex is also known. It looks like this. Again, no evidence of feathers and rather a scaly hide. Why do these tyrannosaurs appear to lack feathers when many of their smaller relatives have them? Well, today, a lot of modern large-bodied mammals like elephants and rhinos and hippos don't have very much in the way of hair. They've evolved to have reduced hair because one major function of hair is to hold in body heat. That fuzzy covering across small-bodied dinosaurs was there to keep them nice and warm. But as an animal gets larger, if it lives in warm environments, it's more concerned with getting rid of heat. It's more in danger of overheating, and it's less concerned with holding in the warmth that its body produces. If an elephant here had a woolly coat, it would die of heat stroke. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Tyrannosaurus rex was truly a featherless dinosaur. Remember, even though the big African elephant here has mostly got a hairless hide, it does still have hair in a few places. That might well have been the case of Tyrannosaurus rex as well. So when I think of Tyrannosaurus rex, I envision it as mostly being scaly, but very likely with patches of hair-like feathers here and there. It may also be the case that Tyrannosaurus rex was a lot fuzzier when it was young. We have no direct evidence of feathers or scales in baby tyrannosaurs, but many of those same large-bodied mammals that are largely hairless as adults have a higher concentration when they're small. Because again, when you're a small-bodied animal, you've got to worry about losing too much heat. A little hatchling tyrannosaur that's just come out of its egg might have benefited from having a lot of fluffy, down-like feather covering its body. Now let's talk about the face of Tyrannosaurus rex. You're looking at the bones from one side of Scotty's face. Its skull was not found with all the various bones that make it up nice and pieced together. Rather, they were all separate. This is a wonderful thing for dinosaur paleontologists because it means that each individual skull bone can be studied from all sides. That gives us a lot of insight into the form of Scotty's face. Now, if I asked you to name a horned dinosaur, you might name things like Triceratops or Styracosaurus. You might say Stygimoloch, the pachycephalosaur. All those dinosaurs absolutely have horns, but the answer of Tyrannosaurus rex is also true because Tyrannosaurus is a horned dinosaur. Look closely on this head. You can see right above the eye socket, there's a great big boss of bone, a big bony lump sticking up. And if you have a look down around the cheek region, the bone that we call the jugal, there's another big lump sitting there. Both of those are horns. Let's talk about that big lump above the eye socket, the postorbital boss. What did it do? Well, it's not a very pointy horn. Rather, it seems to have provided more of a helmet-like structure to a tyrannosaur, probably protecting its eye. Now, Tyrannosaurus rex is not a dinosaur that would have charged headlong at its prey. No, it probably charged with its mouth wide open at them. So what was the function of the helmet? What was it protecting it from? The skulls of some tyrannosaurs do show evidence of bites from other tyrannosaurs. This may have helped to protect Scotty's head from being chomped down on by a member of the same species. It has also been suggested that tyrannosaurs may have engaged in headbutting competitions. There's not a lot of great evidence to support this other than the presence of the boss itself. But if it's true, what were the tyrannosaurs fighting over? Well, most likely they were fighting over the same things that headbutting animals today fight over. Probably mating rights, rank within the pack or herd, and disputes over territory. The second horn is called the jugal horn. Have a look at its texture. You can see that it's not nice and smooth bone. Rather, it's all crinkly and wrinkly and porous. In that way, it looks very similar to bones like this. This is not from a tyrannosaur. This is what we call an osteoderm or a scute. It belongs to an ankylosaur, one of the armored herbivorous dinosaurs. And the reason it's got this porous, wrinkly texture to it is because in life, flowing across its surface would have been a lot of blood. It's there because growing over top was a sheath of material called keratin. Keratin is the same stuff that your fingernails are made out of. They're the same stuff that covers the horns of modern day animals and the claws of cats and birds. By adding a keratinous sheath over top of this structure, it may have been quite sharp. But keratin needs a supply of blood in order to grow. That's why we have to trim our fingernails, because it's always growing. So when you imagine the head of Scotty, be sure to give it a keratinous-covered jugal horn on the side. Again, this horn may have been a bit of protection against tyrannosaur face biting, or it may simply have been an impressive display structure, a sort of dinosaurian cheek stud. And also, give Scotty a crown, a big postorbital boss, also covered in keratin. As the oldest known Tyrannosaurus rex, Scotty gives us some insight into what it was like for Tyrannosaurus rex to grow up. And it reveals that it wasn't a pleasant experience. Throughout Scotty's skeleton, you can find many examples of pathologies. Pathologies are injuries or evidence of disease. You're looking at one of them. This is one of the heads of Scotty's ribs. And that's not the way a tyrannosaur rib head ought to look. You can see there's a large swollen section to it with a big crack running right down the middle. This looks to be a rib that was broken in life and then healed back together. What could have broken Scotty's rib? Well, there are plenty of possibilities. Scotty might have just tripped and fallen on itself. Its great weight could have done this to itself. It's also possible that Scotty could have been bashed by the tail club of an ankylosaur, or been charged headlong and sideswiped by a triceratops. Here are Scotty's left and right skull bones. I'm going to draw your attention to a curious structure we see in the lower jaw. You can see there at the back, there's a nice round hole. This is not a place where we're missing the bones. It's too unusually circular for that. And there's another one in a different location on the other jaw. These look very similar to pathologies we can find today in modern day birds. Many birds will suffer from bone-eating bacterial infections, and it looks like Scotty did as well. Now, here's a view of some of Scotty's tooth sockets. Again, these are the holes where the teeth would have fit into in life. You can see that most of them have got a nice round shape to them. But look at the one there in the middle. It's too gosh darn small, and there's all this ugly asymmetrical bone that's grown around it. It looks like Scotty suffered a severe injury to its face. The bones in its mouth got broken and they had to re-heal. And when they did, they started to grow in to one of those tooth sockets. So Scotty was in serious need of a dinosaur dentist. But perhaps the most serious injury to Scotty is in its tail. Many of its tail vertebrae show evidence at the tips that they're just missing parts. What could have removed some of the bones from Scotty's tail vertebrae? Well, that's unclear, but a good candidate would have been another tyrannosaur. As we'll talk about in a moment, tyrannosaurs had bites that were capable of chomping right through bone. So it wasn't good to be the king of the dinosaurs. Surviving as the apex predator of the late Cretaceous was a hard job. Throughout its life, Scotty suffered multiple injuries, and it suffered from infection, from disease. It may have been attacked by members of its own species. Remember, these are animals that had to make their living by pursuing multi-ton herbivores, many of them armed with intimidating horns and armor, and some of them, even the duckbill dinosaurs, were just so gosh darn large that a kick or a bite or a shove or a swipe of the tail could have been a serious injury. Lastly, I want to chat with you about the arms of Tyrannosaurus rex. People often make fun of T-Rex for having those tiny little arms, and they really are quite small. Tyrannosaurus rex could barely clap. It would struggle to wipe its mouth after a messy meal. And not only are its arms small, but of course, it's reduced its number of fingers. It's lost the outer fingers, and it just has the equivalent of our index and our thumb. Why? It seems very strange to us human beings that an animal would evolve to have such tiny little, seemingly useless arms. We rely on our arms and our hands so much. Well, the answer seems to lie with the teeth of Tyrannosaurus rex. You're looking at one tyrannosaur tooth there, and I'll draw your attention to what you see at the bottom. Sticking up there from the root is actually another tooth. Dinosaurs are like modern day sharks and crocodiles in that they were constantly shedding their teeth. New teeth were always growing in underneath the old ones, pushing them up and replacing them. That would have kept the teeth super sharp, which was important because a major function of a dinosaur's tooth is to cut things. This is a tooth from a Tyrannosaurus rex. And it's often said that T-Rex has teeth like steak knives. People say that because the teeth are so gosh darn big, right? But also, if you look really closely, you may be able to see there's a line running down the side of the tooth. There's actually another one in the backside too. And that line is made up of lots and lots of little bumps called serrations, just like the ridges on a steak knife. These serrations would help the tooth to slice. But that's really where the comparison to steak knives should end, because you can see that the tooth of Tyrannosaurus rex is not nice and flat. It's not really blade-like at all. It's quite round in cross-section. What's more, the tip of the tooth is not even very sharp. Tyrannosaurus rex has relatively dull-tipped teeth, and that's weird. The teeth of most carnivorous dinosaurs really do look like steak knives. They've got serrated edges, plus they are very flat and extremely sharp on the tips, but not Tyrannosaurus. Such thick, blunt-tipped teeth were a unique adaptation. They gave Tyrannosaurs the potential to bite into solid bone. A very thin, pointy tooth could certainly slice through soft stuff, but when it struck solid bone, the tip would have snapped. Tyrannosaurus rex had teeth that were stout enough, at least, to punch right through bone. But did Tyrannosaurus rex have the jaw strength necessary to do so? Absolutely. If you look at this illustration of Scotty's skull here, you can see that the lower jaw is extremely deep, and the skull itself is widened at the back. Those are adaptations that provide extra surface area for great big jaw muscles to attach. So based on the bones, we can reconstruct what the muscles were like. And based on the size of those muscles, it indicates that Tyrannosaurus rex had the most powerful bite of any carnivorous dinosaur. What's more, if we look at the bones of herbivorous dinosaurs, we can see clear evidence of tyrannosaur teeth at work. This is a bone here of a duckbill dinosaur, and you can see running right down the center is a huge puncture from a tyrannosaur fang. But to have a powerful bone-crushing bite like that, Tyrannosaurus rex had to give up something. The early ancestors of Tyrannosaurus rex were small-bodied predators. They had narrow snouts, thin steak knife-like teeth, and long arms with 3 fingers. Over time, the jaws got bigger and thicker, the muscles swelled, and the teeth changed their shape. That was a problem, because meat-eating dinosaurs, from Tyrannosaurus rex to Velociraptor, are naturally built a little bit like a seesaw. Out to one side, they've got the big tail, where enormous leg muscles attach, and then out to the other, you've got the torso, the arms, the shoulders, and the head. Well, to have this biting style, you've got to add on extra weight in the form of those enormous jaw muscles, and that could tip your seesaw out of balance. If Tyrannosaurus rex didn't lose weight from somewhere at the front of the animal, or else grow a ridiculously long tail, the seesaw would be out of kilter, and Tyrannosaurus rex would have fallen flat on its face. And that's why, at the same time that the jaws get bigger and the teeth get thicker, the arms get smaller. The next time you hear someone making fun of Tyrannosaurus rex for having those tiny little arms, remind them that they're there so Tyrannosaurus rex can have a bone-cutting bite. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed our Tyrannosaurus chat. If you're interested in learning more about Scotty, I have recently written a book about him.
That book is called Megarex, and I'd also encourage you to pay a visit to the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, where you can see the bones of Scotty for yourself. Naturally, I'd also encourage you to pay a visit right here to the Mace Brown Museum of Natural History in Charleston, South Carolina. But if you can't make the trip just yet, we've put together an online virtual tour, which you can find at the Mace Brown Museum's YouTube channel. Lastly, I'd like to thank the very gifted paleo artist Beth Zakin, who provided many of the illustrations found throughout this talk and is also the illustrator of the book. Thanks, Beth.